AI off, but anyway. Welcome everybody. We'll get underway because it's 7:04. Just giving you a brief run what the learnings were in Gabrielle, and then we're going to look at what we've got in our situation. So we're going to start with Tim Rhodes. He's a farmer, manages 5,000 hectares that was badly affected in Gabrielle. Then we've got Lachie Grant, who I consider to be a local, but he moves all around the countryside. And he's going to chip in. He was working with Tim. And then we have Sue Quilter, who was the Ravensdown rep in Gisborne, and she's going to let us know what she's learnt. And then we're going to hear from Simon Gall, who is our local Ravensdown representative here, and he's going to step us through what he's observed, and then we'll run into some of the examples that we've had locally. So that's how it's going to go.
Tim, before you just get started, I'll just share some findings of the last 35 years of storms around the show, just to put it in perspective and put a reality check on some of the stuff that's probably going around there. I guess my first storm was the bowler, and I remember going to Gisborne through that period and seeing grapevine posts. And the 2004 event in the Manawatu and Hawke's Bay area. Hey, look, the worst of the erosion occurred on properties, and the worst properties affected only had about 11% of their properties affected. So you're looking at, if you're looking at hillsides and looking at scars, you think, crikey, I've lost half my farm. It's never going to be that bad. What you're seeing is 20% of it's going to be scar and 80% is going to be debris trail. That debris trail is going to regrow grass, and it's still topsoil that's going to come around through on it. And that 92 winter, the research that came out of that, about 65% of poplar and willow space planted trees, properly space planted, reduced the erosion by about 65%. Pines, when they were planted on the right geology, reduced it by about 95%. And natives, they reduced the erosion by about 95%. And, from the flats of the 92 winter, I'm sure you guys have all seen that flow chart that Annette prepared back in that winter when she was at Ag Research. It's a great starting point of what to do where, but that sort of goes through. So the message on that is that, hey, look, things look really bad right now, but they're going to come right. It's not the end of the world. Okay, Tim.
Yeah, and that's right. And look, I'll tear through some photos here to give you a bit of context on what happened to us. So this first slide here that shows the flood path, you can see the river in the middle. This is the main Wi Pere River that heads into Gisborne Township. Down at the bottom here in the white boundary is one of our farms. We've also got another one further up that further up the catchment. What happened is the river, this was higher than Boulder. This went absolutely nuts. And the community flood banks blew as well. And this area in particular down at the bottom here of our land got quite badly affected. So in that area, we've got all sorts of things. We've got centre pivot irrigation for lamb finishing. We've got an apple orchard, kiwi fruit orchard. Oh, no, sorry, not kiwis. Blueberries and tunnels, and a citrus orchard. So this just shows a photo of rocket apples. They were fairly well. These ones over on against the hill, they were well underwater. Like there was about a half a metre of silt through those ones. This debris line you can see coming through here is actually a tidal wave that came through and caused some pretty horrific damage. This is just looking across our flat where you can see in the middle there, you can see our centre pivot, and this debris line was a sort of tidal wave coming through when a bank further up blew, and eventually that whole pivot went underneath underwater. So it gives you an idea of the depth. This is just another shot. We lost some stock. There was a flat down here. We thought we had them on the higher ground, but some of them had stayed on that flat and they got swept away. Another one to give you some context. This is a main road flowing down here. These are silage bales flowing down the road, through the blueberry tunnels, through the citrus orchard. We'd only just built this flood protection area around all our sheds, and this is a nursery here for persimmons, citrus, and blueberries. And luckily, we just finished that flood protection, or all that would have gone.
So Tim, just on that point there, just remember that point where the sheds are, because that's going to come up in a later photo in terms of where sediments, was deposited, and some of the finer materials deposited, and we'll have explanations of why that is. And one of the reasons you really need to know what's going on in terms of that sediment loadings and where it was deposited and how thick it was and what the temperatures were
100%.
like.
This is the first Air New Zealand plane into Gisborne after Gabrielle. So that workshop photo you saw was down here. So this is that big area where the centre pivot is, and we've got a big drain in there. So it was draining out pretty rapidly. Fortunately, we'd only just built that drain.
And where was the maize, Tim, that we'll see in a later photo?
So the next photo I'm going to show you is some maize out here. And then there's some seed maize here that I'll show in a photo as well, just to give you an idea. Apples are in here and under here, all this really thick silt. We actually, I'll touch on, if you remind me to talk about, I'll talk about those apples now. They were that badly affected, we got in there really quickly, sort of within 4 days, to get the silt out to save the plants, but it was actually too deep. So we transplanted those plants, got them out pretty smartly, and got them, because they're only young, they're only not quite 12 months old. So we pulled them all out and replanted those, and now they're going really well. So that was quite a smart move.
So Tim, how much rain did you get at Tangihanga there?
Not too bad. Not too bad in this front country, about 220 odd mils.
Over what time period, mate?
Day and a half.
And bugger all erosion on those hills?
Bugger all erosion, but then we got 100 odd mil the next weekend, and then the place fell to bits.
Yeah.
But the top of the catchment got about 800 or 900 mils in that same period. That's why so much water came down.
And so that was over a really short amount of period. And that tidal wave, how was that created, mate? Was that just a blowout, or?
Yeah, up here, just up about here. About here. Oh no, it takes a bit further up. The main bank's blue, and then that just blew the river straight down here, and that's when the tidal wave came through. What's that?
And point out where Gisborne is.
Gisborne's down here, Gisborne City, top of the screen. So there's the ocean out there right at the top of the screen.
And what about your irrigation pond there, Tim? You might be able to...
Yeah, there's a 250,000 cubic metre storage dam here. We just put flood protection around that. We'd negotiated for the council to do that job. And luckily, and we didn't reckon they'd done the job properly, they left a low bit, and they reckon, no, it's built to spec. Well, no, the low bit was where the water came in. But fortunately, the dam was full, and the water shot across the corner of it, so it didn't fill it up with silt.
And where's your pivot? Show us the centre of your pivot on that previous slide, Tim.
Centre of the pivot's right there, and runs straight up here.
And so that's underwater right now?
No, it would have been coming out by then. When that was underwater, everything in here would have been underwater. So remember, this is probably 5 days after the cyclone, this photo. It's the first plane that came in.
So that time period's quite critical in the sense of pasture starts dying after about 3 or 4 days. And so, all your pivot area, Tim, that was all dead pasture by the end of it?
Yep. Covered in silt.
And how much silt, mate?
I'll show you some photos when we get a bit closer, but and this will come into a bit more context later. At the top end here, now we measured the silt, and this is really quite important. We measured the depth, and I'll show you some photos later, but it was basically about 6 inches right at this top end to about 1.5 meters down at the bottom end. So we did, and then out in this area here, about 6 inches, because the river shot across quite quickly. But I'll show you how we worked all that out a little bit later in a photo. Just to give you an idea of some of the velocity, so that's that maize paddock. That's a shipping container that ended up in the middle of that maize paddock. So I thought
From you or from further upstream?
I know from further upstream. I thought I was in storage wars. I thought I'd hit a gold mine, but no, it was full of crap, unfortunately. That gives you an idea. That was mature maize, ready to be harvested, pretty much. Flattened a lot of it. Some of it still stood up, and that probably had 3 meters of water flowing over top of it. They still harvested it, but the yield was absolutely, it was no good. That's some seed maize that was completely buggered.
So what did you do with that, Tim?
Interestingly enough, I'll come to that a little bit when I talk about how we sowed it, and to just remember about seed maize, I'll come back to that. This is some of our blueberries. So this shows the depth of the water. I mean, there's a silage bale stuck there. So all the blueberries in pots, so they were all rolled up in a corner of the net in the far corner. In fact, the boys, right or about where that truck is, launched a 6.5 metre Stabycraft on the road and went to see if they could sow some sheep. So it gives you a bit of an idea on how deep that water was.
So you can see the lines up the lamppost, can you? Or
Well, that's the lines on the net, and that would be,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not very tall, but that's way over my head. Like that ended up in the center pivot, so it just gives you an idea of some of the debris we had to pick up. But now we get into what we were faced with. So this is what we're faced with this silt. So this now is about a week after the cyclone. Now that silt is about a bit over waist deep there, and it is liquid. It's like soup. So it gives you a bit of an idea. It was just absolutely shocking. So I thought, good Lord, what do I do? I had no clue. So Lachie and I have been working together for quite a few years on basically farm plans and best land use and environmental stuff and all that sort of thing. So he was the first person I rang. I rang him and I said, what are we going to do? And he said to me, get a helicopter. So that's the first thing I did. Well, I couldn't get a helicopter because Civil Defence had locked them all up, but I was the first on the list to get a helicopter, and then order every scrap of grass seed you can possibly get. So I just got on the phone to Temuka Seeds down in Temuka and ordered a truck and trailer load of annual grass seed. I didn't know how much I needed, but I knew a truck and trailer would go a fairly long way to covering it. It was just the point I'm making here is getting the stuff really quickly. So then we found a little helicopter like a Robbie 22 that Civil Defence didn't need. So we got a hold of the pilot, and Lachie said, plant it. And I said, you're mad. I said, that's still water and there's water running off the top of it. And it's soup. I can walk through it. You could just about swim through it. And he said, no, plant it. And I thought, oh yeah, this will be a waste of money. So anyway, we got in and planted it. And then that's what it looked like 8 weeks post cyclone. The whole lot of it struck. It was unbelievable. So once we did that, we got on to Sue, because Sue, who you'll hear about soon, she's also part of our team. So we got on to Sue and said, right, Sue, what are we going to do with fertility? Didn't worry about soil tests because we knew the P levels would have gone from, they were about 60 in there, somewhere around there, and we knew they'd be like 3 or 4. So we just made that assumption. We knew the pH would be really high. So we just hooked in and put, Sil, correct me if I'm wrong, but I won't be too far away. I think it was about 250 kilos of crop 20 went on first. And then this is so hungry. Sue and Ernst Roberts came up with a plan for us that then we had to put on DAP basically about every 2 months until we got, it was, the first lot was half a tonne of DAP to the hectare. And then it was like 200 kilos to the hectare, sort of 6 or 7 weeks after that. And then just kept going until we got basically our fertility back up to kind of the mid-30s. But what ended up happening, this grass grew that well, you still couldn't stand up on here, and it was knee-high grass. No fences, everything was all buggered in there. The only mistake I made here is if you look on the left-hand side, here's the seed maize paddock. And Lachie said before, what did I do to that? I didn't do anything because I didn't think the seed would get down through the seed maize, like it would get all hooked up in the plants. But when I realised how well this worked, I kicked myself and got the chopper back and sowed it, and I got a reasonable result, but I would have had a whole lot better result if I'd done it straight away. So
But
that's number one
most of your
reason.
germination, Tim, was in the cracks.
Yeah, yeah,
When you
because
were
it had
late.
started to dry out. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right, Lachie. Yep. So then we waited until eventually this got dry enough, and then but the beauty about this, we could do our winter lamb trade. So because we had grass, the first mob of lambs we put on there, about 40 of them got stuck in the mud, and you can imagine trying to lift a lamb out of the mud. As soon as you put a bit of pressure on yourself, you'd sink up to your waist, and then the buggy got stuck, and then you'd come down with the tractor to get the buggy out, and the tractor got stuck. So you'd come down with the digger to get the tractor out, and the digger would get stuck, and then it was like, oh my god. So I went on holiday. I left the boys to it, but the really important thing was to get this going fast for a couple of reasons. Not only that meant that we could do a winter lamb trade, so we were actually earning some money again, but one of the equally as important thing is to get some root structure back into this crappy silt. Um, so that worked really well. So then when things started to dry out, we needed to realize or work out what we had in terms of silt, both texture and depth. And Lachie might want to, you can explain what we did here, Lachie, and what this
Oh,
is.
look, yeah, but before you go there, look, at the end of the day, your topsoil is your fridge. It's the fridge for your pasture. It contains everything. It contains your soil moisture. It contains your nutrients. It contains the air paths for drainage and the air for plants. What you've got nothing there. You've got this mass of sediment that's got no structure. The texture's variable across the site depending on, whether it was fast running water or slow running water. If it was fast running water, you ended up with coarse textured material. And if it was slow running water, if it sat around for a few days, it was mostly, silts and even finer into the clay stuff. So, you had such variability across the site, and combine that with the variability of the depth. You've got a three-dimensional beast that you've got to deal with, really. And so the first thing we got to the springtime, we needed to know what's our management for the next 3 to 4 months, sort of thing, going through. What's Tim going to do in the spring? Is some of that going to be regrassed, or is he going to oversow over the top of it, or what's he going to do, or put a drill over it, or is he going to wait to the autumn, or is it 2 years or whatever? So we actually needed to know, the both the depth of that sediment and the texture of that sediment. So what this machine was, it's a electromagnetic sensor that's dragged behind the bike. It's got GPS accuracy. It's shooting down about I don't know, 10 beats, 10 strikes a second, sort of thing. So we're getting all this powerful information and data coming back. We're getting out with about 3,000 to 5,000 data points per hectare. So we actually have a fair idea of what's going on in terms of that sediment depth and textures going through on it. And
So
look, we talked about before, and I'll get Tim to point out where the sheds were, but we talked about before, where the sheds were in that curve and the pivot, and that's only part way through. But the red stuff indicates, look, it's really fine and really deep material, and we've got to treat that differently than the dark green at the bottom of the picture there, where it's often a lot shallower and a lot coarser, or more silt material rather than silty clay material. So, that basically was the start of your management going forward, wasn't it, Tim?
Yeah, so from an operational point of view, this was awesome because I could work out what I would have, without this information, I would have gone in and put the same uh, management, if you like, or recovery practice over this whole block. But I didn't, because I had this information. I knew that in this green area, I could go in with a really deep plough and flip most of that topsoil back up and bury the silt. So what we did is we went through in this green area and deep ploughed it. And then when we got into this yellow area, that was too deep for the plough, but we went in with these massive, massive discs and blended and that was able to blend up some of the topsoil with the silt. And then in this red stuff, which is like 2 meters deep, we were never going to get anywhere near it. So we just direct drilled it. So that meant we could put in different pastures. because I didn't particularly, because 160 odd hectares in here, and I didn't really want to have to be doing this all the time, regrassing all the time. So it meant I could put a perennial rye and clover back up in here and know that that's going to be, going fairly well. I put a 3-year ryegrass and clover in the middle block because I was thinking, oh yeah, well, that's probably going to peter out, or I'm going to have silting issues because there's a shitload of silt in there. And then in this really thick stuff, I just direct drilled straight red clover. And that was with a view to try and get that taproot right down and into some of that old topsoil and just get some root structure going. And it did. And we reckon we could tell by the growth of that red clover when that taproot hit the old topsoil, because it just took off. So it was really interesting. So that just enabled us to come up with a management plan for the following spring when it was dry enough to get on. That was a lot more, well, it just gave us information to make some really good decisions. And then interestingly enough, from that, and you should be able to see this in the screen, this is some of this top stuff that was ploughed. And I said to Lachie, something wrong with this paddock. This is 2 years after the cyclone in Sue, and we were all going, oh yeah, well, it's probably, could be this, could be that. And then actually one day Lachie said, why don't you just run some, it's probably urea or nitrogen, just run the food truck up and down the paddock. Don't do it normally, just miss every second run, and look at the stripes. And those stripes came up within sort of 3-4 weeks, or no, less, 2 or 3 weeks after application. So just really put that photo up to highlight, once you do recover, how how kind of hungry that's going to be, and keep throwing nitrogen in it, because that grass is crap without the nitrogen.
But
It's looking pretty good now. Clover content's pretty good, but yeah, it's been a battle.
it goes back to, your structure's not particularly great because you've got all that young sediment on there mixed in with it, but your organic matter is really, really low, and that's part of the stuff that's driving your nitrogen cycle coming through on it. So
Yeah.
it's a matter of, if you want to grow grass, you've got to feed it what it needs, really.
How long are you expected to add the nitrogen for how many years do you really have to be intensive with that?
Well, that's 2 years after, and I was still going.
Okay.
I'd pulled the throttle back, thinking, no, I'm good to go, because I was getting worried. I didn't want to smother out the clover. But this particular area here, the rest of it not as bad. It's just this particular area was particularly bad. And yeah, so that's been basically 2 years of throwing urea or nitrogen at it.
And how Lachie, how regularly did you do that per year? Or
In the beginning, I was throwing it at it every 6 to 8 weeks, and you could see it from the prescription that we were given. I didn't need to look at my diary. I could just go, oh yeah, we must be due for another application, because it's starting to go yellow. And you'd look at your diary and go, oh yeah, I've missed it by a day, or it's due next week. Or, yeah, it was bizarre. So Sue and Ants absolutely nailed the recommendations.
Yeah. Tim, where was the maize in that picture?
Yeah, in this area.
So, the maize in itself, trying to bury that organic matter, it took up all the microbes, the microbes having a crack at it, and, it's sucking up the nitrogen too. So, it's a double whammy for you, really, wasn't it?
It was definitely where the seed maize was the worst for nitrogen. Is the hungriest and has needed the most nitrogen to come right, and way more than I would have ever thought.
Hey Tim, what about your grazing regime? How are you targeting what animals go where and for how long, and how do you make those decisions?
Yeah, well, it's been really tricky because this stuff's so hard to manage. In terms of, you get a shower rain and it'll just go black. The silt, well, even now, it's been pretty tricky this winter. So it's been really careful with stock density, not getting. So instead of having, say, these 4 paddocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and say you want to set stock, say you want to have lambs in there at say 40 to the hectare. Well, you wouldn't have one big mob going around 4 paddocks. You'd have 2 mobs flip-flopping between just 2 paddocks. So you keep the actual stock density down. Otherwise, you start to run into trouble, because if you get a shower rain, they'll seal that that silt off again, and then you're just about back to well, you are just about back to square one again. And what we're going to do this year, young, because then there's parasite issues you've got to worry about too, drench resistance. So this year we're going to have young cattle with cattle collars on in there, so we can just break feed them under the pivot, but not at too high a stock density. And with the cattle collars, we don't need to worry about tapes and the pivot getting all tangled up in the bloody tapes and brakes. And so that's how we're going to try and manage it this year.
So a really good way to determine whether your pasture, these pastures are good to putting cattle on, even young cattle, because the sediment, you haven't got the structure there. You know, it hasn't had time to build up that soil structure. You know, that's your little, you know, lattice of brickwork in your soils. But a really good way is to pick up a piece of sediment or a piece of topsoil in your hand, and if you can mold it and without adding water to it and form a worm, it's too wet. Okay, it's and if you take note of that, you're not going to do that damage to that new soil that's trying to develop on top there. Tim, you had some animal health issues with your lands when you first put them on?
Actually, yep, but just one thing, I'm going to completely change the subject while I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about saving fences. So we were able to save quite a few of the post fences in here, but the trick was couldn't save all the wires, but the trick was to go in there before it got too dry, and we could do it with either a tractor and a chain or a digger, and just very quietly shake the posts up, and they'll ping the wires off the deep silt. But we saved thousands and thousands doing that. If we had waited too long and the silt had set too much, we would have just snapped the posts off. So that's just
Didn't you
another
have some posts that rose from the dead after time? Yeah.
Yeah. And the silt settles too. Like you know, where we only just had the very top of the posts poking out of the silt, or you couldn't even see the posts. All of a sudden you'd see it appear, and then a couple of weeks later there'd be a foot poking out of the silt. But basically, as soon as you can get a tractor or a digger on there, start lifting up those posts, and you'll save yourself thousands. But back to the animal health issue, yeah, we had issues with lambs with scald, with the silt getting stuck in their claws in their hooves. So, and that's a bit of a major because they stop, obviously they stop growing. And if it's in the summer, they end up getting fly-blown feet, which is bloody horrendous. Or they get maggots in their feet, and then they scratch their sort of side or their flank, and all of a sudden you've got a fly-blown, awful. So when you start seeing that happening, you've got to run them off, ideally onto tar seal, and then just run them up and down a tar seal road, and it'll blow the silt out of their feet. But it's the only way you can do it. Wet grass won't do it. A shingle track won't do it. Well, a hard baked shingle track might do it, but tar seal is the best if you've got it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tim.
That fly blown a hoof, and then when they lay down and put their foot up against their flank, that's just horrendously cruel, because you don't really know they've got it until you see the odd dead lamb, and then oh god, and then once that happens you can lose heaps of them.
So Tim, how often are you monitoring these paddocks in terms of looking to see how deep the roots have got down, you know, how yellow the pastures are going? What are you doing in terms of monitoring this to know that you're going to get production going forward? Because at the end of the day, if you don't grow grass, you don't make a dollar.
Yeah, so for those first 2 years it was really regular, and both Lachie and Sue, I'm sure, used to get sick of me ringing them saying, I'm not happy with this paddock, it looks like crap, what are we going to do about it? Then I'd get an agronomist and say, oh, I think your grass is rubbish, we're going to have to buy some new grass, and blah blah blah. So it was super regular monitoring, and that's really important, just to make sure that you learn a lot too, asking all those questions. But yeah, really important to keep monitoring it. The other thing you've got to be really careful of is all the nasty bloody weeds that turn up that you might never have had. So we had to be really onto it with our spraying and our timing, and actually getting somebody that understood and knew what some of these weeds were, because some of them we'd never seen before. Because we had all sorts of stuff in here. We had a 6-meter boat trailer, we had portaloos, we had all sorts of rubbish and stuff turn up in here. So you can imagine the weeds.
Just for the spraying of the weeds, does that affect the new grass?
Very good question. It was fine when it was just the annual ryegrass, because you can use quite a few heavy hitters, if you like, chemical. So I made sure that I took advantage of that and sprayed out as many of the nasty weeds while I didn't have any legumes or anything in my my new pasture mixes. But I had to be very careful that I didn't use anything with a residual. And you have to get really good advice, because your pHs are normally going to be really high. So therefore, some of the chemical reaction in the soil can be really random. So you need to talk to the chemical reps and go, hey, look, this is flooded. I might have a pH of 7, 8, 9. Am I going to end up with a horrible residual if I spray some weeds in my annual, then go and plant a legume? 12 months later, your legume doesn't come up. Well, it could be because of a residual. So there are the things that you've got to be really, really careful of, because the chemistry in the soil is a bit weird.
Mm.
Tim, is there a reason why you used red clover instead of white clover?
And the real deep stuff. I wanted I did chuck a bit of white clover in with it as well. But the white wasn't my that wasn't I wanted red. I wasn't too worried about the white. And the reason I wanted the red was that long taproot. I wanted to get a long taproot root structure getting down into that deep silt.
All right, thank you.
What about irrigation, Tim? Is that this new regime created challenges for you, having irrigation? You probably haven't had it in the
Nightmare,
last couple of years. It's been too wet for you, but
it never stops raining. Anyone want to buy a second-hand pivot? It's going cheap. But no, it's this is quite a long pivot. It's about 700 meters to the corner arm, so there's a lot of weight in the end of that. So when we got this thing going again and needed it, because the silt was dusty and working out, we just needed to get some water on there. Well, we were forever getting it stuck down in the bottom end, the bottom 2 towers, because of the weight. So that was a real boo-boo. What I would do next time is I would run this pivot round and round empty first with no water in it. Then I would walk around and I'd work out where all the little potholes are and the soft spots, and go and fill them up with metal before I put any water in it. Because we've done all that now, but we did all that after we put water in it. So instead of doing a little pothole like that, we were doing potholes that were nearly waist deep. But the biggest issue was we were getting this thing stuck when we really needed the water, and it might have taken us a day to get it out. Random things happen, like it'll get stuck and it'll peel a wheel off, peel a tire off. So then you had to get the tire fixed, and you were panicking because it was getting dry and the nor'westers were blowing and had lots of young grass like that. And it was like, oh God, that was stressful. Whereas if I had have ran it round dry, found where the soft spots were, fixed it before any of the pressure came on, would have been a way better option.
what about your water supply system, Tim? What were your challenges associated with that?
We're pretty lucky because we use our dam was fine, and a little bit of silt that had gone in and settled out pretty quick. So we had our water storage there, and from a river point of view, we have a portable system to pump into our water reservoir. So we were okay from a water supply point of view.
Okay, what about troughs from the
Oh,
livestock point?
well, there was the positives and the negatives for the troughs. Some of the troughs were actually starting to go up on those mushrooms and needed to have dirt put around them. Well, not anymore. We had to go the other way and go and find the bloody troughs and dig them out. So that was a nightmare digging them out, and that was a big old job. But now we've got all these beautiful troughs that are like at ground level. So it's that's been a little bit of a positive. But again, just as a wee bit of a hint, the best way we found to get those going, while the silt was still slushy, get some water going in them. And then we bought a cheap Chinese pump, and they were bugger all, they were like $200. And then we just swirl the silt round and round and round, put this pump in, and it would just sludge it all out.
So why did you buy a cheap Chinese pump, Tim? Was that because it was going to be buggered by the end of the exercise? What was the reason?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because it was not designed to do what we were doing it with. And we didn't know how this was going to work. We were basically putting silt and sludge through a water pump. And oh, yeah, it was buggered by the end of it, but for the price of it, it did the job and we got it done really quickly.
And if you had your time again, Tim, would you re-fence differently, or you're happy with the subdivisions the way it was, or is there any opportunities that you could have taken but didn't take, or wanted to take but thought were too expensive or whatever?
I was pretty happy with what I did. I made the most of it because I claimed insurance where I could. So I really made the most of that. And then when we'd originally fenced this block, we didn't have GPS tractors or anything like that. So our paddocks are a bit random. And, they'd sort of go off on funny angles and you think you got it straight, but you didn't. And you used to look at it from the air and it was terrible. Or you'd be driving a tractor in it and you'd end up with all these funny angles. So it did enable us to get all the paddocks exactly the same size and GPS nicely. So that's helped really well with our grazing management.
And challenges in the hill country, mate?
Oh, yeah, that was heinous. One of our farms further up, the catchment, it's about a 3,000 hectare farm. We had to employ 3 extra guys for 12 months. Spent about 400 grand on that farm, and we're still, and that's just basically got a lot of the paddocks back into shape, but a lot of the subdivisions still buggered. So that's hugely expensive. Luckily, we hadn't traded. We just bought a new digger and hadn't traded our old one. So we had 2 diggers, which is a good thing, still have. So that's really costly. Just getting all that stuff fixed.
So opportunities, if you haven't got fencing proper, 2 years later, and you're trying to get feed quality going through, lessons that you could bring forward now that if you had that time again, like collars and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I think what we did is we had made up a bit of a decision tree on some of these fences. We asked ourselves how many times we fixed that fence in the last 5 years because of a slip or some type of erosion. And if the answer was more than 2 times in the last 5, that fence came out. So we pulled quite a few fences out, went from 25 hectare paddocks to sort of 50 and 60 hectare paddocks in some cases. But now, and we've now got a few of these cattle collars, these Gallagher virtual fencing collars, and that's the way to go, in my view, going forward, because man, it's expensive to keep fixing these fences. So now we can have a bigger paddock, the sheep can roam, they go really well, and the cows can come through and kind of break feed through amongst the sheep. Well, you just farm the cows like as if you had 4 paddocks, and then the sheep can just cruise underneath it. So we've got some very happy ewes and some cows that think they're sort of second-class citizens, poor old girls. But funnily enough, that hasn't happened. The cows are better than what they ever used to be because we're creating better pasture quality, and we're actually pushing them up onto the bits they didn't want to be on because it's steep, but there's actually quite a feed there for them. So it's made a massive difference. Oh, and then I could talk about this for hours, which I won't because we're going off topic a bit, but there's just so many advantages about those collars.
So it's easier to have a ewe flock that's bigger with bigger paddocks rather than 2 or 3 flocks that's floating around, and so you get better control that way, or better live weight gains and everything else that's associated with it.
Yep. The only thing on the hill country we had to, because sometimes in the winter and rotations we'll run quite big mobs, like sort of 3,500, 4,000 ewes sort of thing. But you can't really be doing that after you've had a Gabrielle type event or any decent flood event. The risk of having a smother or something going wrong is just you just got to be all over that stuff. So you just got to be really careful. But we couldn't have a road. We've only just started being able to get rotations going this year because you put a mob of ewes together and we always used to laugh at it, go and muster paddock number 10 and surrounding districts because the bloody sheep are gone everywhere. So yeah, it was kind of a bit frustrating.
Okay, guys, I think we've come to the end. Is there any other key points you want to make before we go on to Sue?
Oh, we just want to talk about what we did in the holidays, innit? What are your 5 take-home points, Tim?
Well, I've probably got 4 there. First thing I do, ask for advice if you don't know. Everyone will help. Make a list and prioritize your list because there's so much stuff bouncing around in your head. Often it's, you can spend a lot of time just wondering what the hell you should do. So as soon as we got a pen and paper out and prioritised, that was good, and got our advisors and people that we knew to help us prioritise, order gear quickly, which I talked about, and then just get on with it. Don't just get on with it, because any decision is better than no decision after a flood.
Yeah, I guess my 4 or 5 take-home messages for you guys is that the sooner you get on with it, the sooner you're back in production, and it's all about that. Second thing was, hey, look, I think it's a waste of money and removing the sediment. Don't do that. You want to. You certainly want to. If you remove the sediment, you're still lowering the dirt down, and you're more prone to flooding in the future. Third thing was, you need to understand, the sediment depths and textures, and that will drive your future management. The fourth thing is, look, if you don't monitor, you can't manage. So, you need to monitor those things like rooting depths, the soil moisture levels and nitrogen status and the fert stuff. And just remember, the fifth thing is, just remember those alluvial soils that you've got, they're going to develop into great soils. You just got to recognize what their own strengths and limitations are for them, and just manage them accordingly. And you've got to treat them like with kid gloves for the first couple of years. Seriously. That's me.
Excellent, thank you. So I've got your talk up there. I'm hoping you can see it.
Thank you very much. Yes, it doesn't seem to want to produce from mine, so that's an excellent solution. Thanks, Annette. Actually, if you skip down to the fifth slide, it follows on from what Tim was saying. It's actually photos of those. Next one down. There's next one up. Yep. So that's actually the areas that Tim was talking about. On the left is the red clover planted area, direct drilled, not cultivated up because the silt was too deep, and on the two on the right are the yellow looking paddocks he was pointing out that was a clover and ryegrass following the maize. And so it wasn't just the maize that was sucking all the nitrogen out as well. It was the problem with the clover wasn't producing very well. You can see it's a bit pale, that right hand picture. And one of the real issues was that in that cultivated ground was, like Tim was saying, there's very little structure with stock on it. And we had continuous rain through that winter into the spring, and the soil just reconsolidated. Although it had been cultivated up, mixed in with some of the underlying soil, the underlying soil was also a silt, fairly young with minimal structure. So that you can see the blue and rusty areas down a few centimetres. So that was limiting the clover's ability to perform as well, as the lack of nitrogen exacerbated by the maize being, seed maize being broken down. So that's, again, the monitoring that Lachie is talking about, really important to, look at that sort of stuff. And if you go back up to, yep, that one. Mm-hmm. So one of the first things that, just on from what Tim and Lachie were saying, some of the things farmers have said following all these flood events we've had, Manawatu and Hawke's Bay and Wairoa and Gisborne, some of the classic things, as Tim said, make a list and prioritise is one of the biggest ones. But working with your neighbours when you're organising helicopters, especially smaller block holders, if you can work in together, you'll improve your efficiency. If you're organised and do multiple jobs for that helicopter, it'll keep the costs down. And there's quite a few times you need those choppers early on, and the bills can mount up. So that was something farmers were saying is really important. Shade cloth in the short term seemed to be quite useful for blocking up holes and repairing fences, giving yourself a bit of space. Like Tim was saying, if you got your list and prioritised, if you could just get a moderately good fix for a short time, you can move on to something else that's really important. And offered help, as Tim was saying, people are dead keen to help if they can. So if offered, even if it's something simple like the road that you drive up and down every day, if somebody's happy to go and strip the debris off it so it looks like a normal fence again, and you don't see it every day when you go up and down, that can actually make a big difference to the mental health. And really the key is that time heals. Lots of people have been through these events before, and most of them say that they come out stronger for it. And keeping, one thing I've noticed, keeping records and something you can go back to, a playbook that you can go back to, or even if it doesn't happen again in your farming career, next person on the property, if you've had a flood, it's probably going to happen again. Luckily, they don't happen too often. So yeah, having the playbook and the learnings, that was where we got a bit of a head start this time, because we had a whole lot of learnings that was shared after Gabrielle, and that really seemed to help some people. Thanks, Annette. The Gisborne District Council did a lot of work looking at the benefit of mixing the sediment where it wasn't too deep. So like Tim was saying, where you've got it shallow enough that you can mix it in with underlying soil. Usually that soil was previously reasonably good fertility, and it did seem to moderate some of the major effects. The pH, our pH is like yours down there. It was very high in the silt, and in most cases the pH was moderated by mixing it in with silt that was less than 15 centimeters deep. The Olsen P in the silt was very low, sort of 4 to 10, and when you mixed it in, it lifted, and really the amount that it lifted depended on how good the fertility originally was underneath and the depth of the silt. So the greater the amount of silt, the less it'll rise. But even at the lowest point, you at least doubled the Olsen P. Even if it started at 4, lifted to 8, it's at least saving you 20 kilos of P, or 250 or 230 kilos of super equivalent that you don't have to then do to try and get the topsoil back up to where you can, where you're going to have reasonable production. Oh, sorry, I should have explained. Sorry, the grey lines were the silt test, and the black lines were the tests after that same site, exactly the same GPS site, had been cultivated. Sorry, I should have explained at the start. And as Lachie was pointing out, that organic matter in the topsoil is your king. It stores your nitrogen and the sulfur, it moderates the water drainage, and it's important for aeration. And plants need as much air as they need water. So Tim's success in using that red clover to get some holes effectively going down in the soil, allowing that drainage, and then helping the organic matter develop to depth, developing that structure, really absolutely critical. And the key to organic matter is the more you grow and graze, the faster your organic matter will build up. So just like Lachie said, the sooner you can get something growing, the sooner you're going to be back up developing a soil again. The pictures here, the bottom right is it's 15 to 30 centimeters deep on some of our silt soils up the coast. And you can see there it's sort of got a rusty look to it. So that silt wasn't draining, and that there's going to be maize on that area, and they put some really big munty rippers through there. And the maize yield out of there wasn't your best, but it certainly was a maize yield that was, I think it was about 12 tonne to the hectare, a grain, that more than paid for the work done in there. The picture of the maize crop there, green in the front, quite yellow and stunted further across, that's the effect of the depth of silt. They've managed to work in the previous stubble and bring up some of the underlying soil in the foreground, and the background that was deeper. And also there was a lot of pine tree debris in that area, so that would have been soaking up a fair bit of nitrogen, trying to break down as well. But like Tim was saying, this is maize paddocks. Thanks, Annette. So following on from what Tim and Lachie were talking about, it's really important to know your soil depth as to whether you're going to be deep enough that you shallow enough, sorry, that you can bring up some underlying soil, and the fertility of the silt. In our area, once you had a couple of samples and even samples from previous events, you kind of knew what the silt was going to be. So you don't have to test every paddock. It's more important to know what the depth is and what the underlying fertility was. If it was a good fertility before and it's shallow enough, the silt's shallow enough to cultivate, it's actually the fertility, previous fertility is probably a really good indicator of where you're going to get close to once you cultivate. And the other thing about bringing up the underlying soil, it does bring up some organic matter as well. So it helps hold on to your sulfurs, nitrogens, reduce the losses in further rain. In our area, the pH was really high, and I understand from the samples I've seen the same thing down your way. So for God's sake, don't lime. It's one of the things a lot of people immediately think, oh, lime's going to be good for my soil. It's only good when the pH is low. We're below optimal, and the pH is well above optimal. You'll actually create problems if you lime. So if you hear of anybody saying they're going to lime, for God's sake, stand in front of them and say, please don't. Lower nitrogen, because it's subsoil that's come down. It's got very little organic matter in it, and that's your store of nitrogen for nutrients and stuff. So we know it's low. Like Tim said, you're going to have to be prepared to put nitrogen on, but also work quickly to get it into some nitrogen producing, some legume where you can, so that early on, weed control early on, and then quickly into legumes would be really important. Low phosphate, same as you've got, the same as us, but I understand some of your phosphate retentions down there are even lower than ours, and that means that the phosphate you add has the potential to leach. Most soils don't leach phosphate, but very low phosphate retention or anion storage capacity soils can leach. So in those conditions, you'd probably want to spread your capital out. So perhaps don't go above 30 to 40 kilos of phosphate in one application. Not a problem if your phosphate retention sort of well above 10 to 15%. We didn't have the issue about low potassium. Now I understand Annette dealt with floods in the Manawatu, and that area had low potassium, so she might be able to speak to that as to how critical putting that in is. But my thoughts would be, where it's super low, some, but don't go majorly heavy on that, because it's quite an expensive nutrient and it does leach. So a little bit as you're getting things started to help the plants get established and get the roots down into the underlying soil is probably the best option. And low sulfur, we didn't have a low sulfur. Our silts are always high sulfur. So I haven't come across that before here, but the elemental sulfur is a slow release sulfur, and that's probably a good option to be putting in to help your legumes. You don't need it for brassicas much, but for legume-based pastures do. Thanks, Annette. So yeah, we've been through that slide with Tim's paddocks there. Further up the coast, we had a chap who put in some kale and plantain. It's one of his options. It was partially successful where it was very deep silt and he wasn't bringing much underlying stuff up. It really struggled. The left-hand photo there really struggled, even with capital fertilizer. But the crop, it's the same crop, same sowing date as the picture on the right. And the picture on the right is where the silt was shallow enough to cultivate into the underlying good fertility soil. Thanks, Annette. Another thing somebody used was oats and ryegrass aerial sown. They didn't do it till about 3 months after the flood, but we were heading into winter at that stage, and it was quite wet, so this struck quite well. I think that may be a bit different for you guys. I understand a lot of your silt is sandier, and we're going into the dry, so this may not be applicable. They couldn't refence, it was so deep, so wet, they couldn't get around the paddock to fence it, re-fence it. So the grass and oats just kept growing, and the picture on the left there is in December. They did have another flood through a few weeks after they sowed in May, and so they got some patches with weeds in it, as you see in the bottom left-hand photo there. But it was still too wet at that stage to go and spray those out, so they stayed there. But it was probably only 10% of the paddock was actually like that. Funnily enough, then come March, so that the stuff's been in the ground 8 months now, they managed to mulch it and disked it in, and then the seed from the seeded oats and ryegrass just popped up again of its own accord, and you got that sort of 50 to 60% ground cover there, so it was actually a bit of a toss-up. What do you do? Do you go and cultivate that in, put yourself behind, or do you just do nothing, or do you top it up with something else? So they went in and cultivated the weedier areas, sprayed well, and cultivated the weedier areas and sowed again. But there actually some more seedlings came up, and they kept the denser ryegrass just through the winter and put it back into maize the following year. Thanks, Annette. So key again, as Tim was saying, legumes are your friend. That nitrogen deficiency is something, no matter how much nitrogen you throw at it, it's going to be hungry for years. So the sooner you can get those legumes in there producing nitrogen for you, the sooner you're going to become more self-sufficient as far as the nitrogen goes. And one of the big issues was weed control. So the two pictures here, the one on the left, they got stuck in, put capital fert and ryegrass and clover in there, and then controlled the weeds post-establishment. And in that picture, the grass is struggling because the clover still hasn't produced a lot of nitrogen yet. But my suggestion there, this was in an area that wasn't critical. They didn't need a huge amount of feed immediately. They had other good crops and things around. So we actually left that, because then the clover has an advantage, and it will keep on producing really well. And give it another 6 months to a year, and that ryegrass will start to find the nitrogen from the clover and start to come away. But in the short term, you're actually you've got reasonable cover, and you're giving the clover an advantage to help it produce to maximum. On the right, the pictures, that's a red clover crop. So again, successful like Tim's. He thought this was an absolutely brilliant solution. He went in first, they put annual through immediately after the silt, just like Tim, and then good weed control pre the legume going in. Did light cultivation with capital fert and sowed the red clover in the spring. So very similar to Tim, very similar result. Thanks, Annette. That might be it. Any questions, comments?
So listening to you, it seems that your recommendation is that you always cultivate the silt into the underlying soil. But is that really only when it's 150 mil and deeper silt? If your silt is shallower than 150 mil, is there worth in just putting a heavy harrow through it or over it and spreading it rather than cultivating it into the topsoil?
The opposite way around. So if it's shallow enough to bring up underlying soil, you always cultivate and bring it up. But you bear in mind about, like I showed that picture of the where it reconsolidated. you bear in mind about how you stock it after that. But where it's deeper than 150 or deeper than you can bring up, I mean, there might be some really heavy equipment that can go bring a significant amount up that's deeper. The experience that the farmers I've worked with shows that it's better off to ignore trying to cultivate up if it's too deep and go for the direct drilling. Tim might have something to add to that.
Probably one comment I'd make, if you can plough it is the ultimate if it's not too deep, because you can actually flip it up and bring that topsoil up. But when you go in with a power harrow, if you've got a contractor, or they won't like it, but get them to do a fairly rough job. Don't beat it to pieces. So our paddocks are pretty bumpy. Like you lose your false teeth if you go too fast across them. But I'm okay with that, because I didn't want to turn it into talcum powder and get that sealing off effect where you get all those orange dots that Sue showed in some of those photos. So if you're going to do it and you're going to put a power over, don't worry about beating it dead flat, and you can worry about that later on when you've got a bit more organic matter in it.
Because our silt was very patchy. There were places where there's no silt deposited at all, and other places quite a bit. And so on part of our property, we've just ended up putting a chain harrow over it and just spread. Now there's a very thin layer everywhere. But you can, in patches, you can still see the soil. So it's kind of, the deepest patch would be maybe 5 or 6 centimeters.
Well,
Is the pasture come back up through it?
Yes, it is starting to come up through it. Yeah.
So for us, in instances like that, because we've had heaps of different floods, and we have some areas that get flooded quite often, we would just direct drill straight into that. We wouldn't worry about flipping that shallow stuff. And I'd do probably what you'd done as well. If it's only going to be like that across everywhere, yeah, I wouldn't worry about the expense of, plows and power harrows, and I'd just direct drill straight into that, because it won't take long for your root structure to get back into your normal topsoil.
Yeah.
What I've got here on the screen now is a photo of the upper farm in the Motueka Valley. On the left is the photo that we would be able to see from the council website. However, the hyperlink below is a link that you can access now through LINS, as they have actually reflown the flood affected areas. So you can see on the left, I think that was about a 2022 photo of the up around Tapawera, and on the right there is just recently flown from July. And our next slide for the Ravensdown farmers, oh, sorry, we've changed slides there. This is actually a farm further down the valley with the new imagery underlying, showing the silt deposition as it's gone across. So you can see in what's called the Lucerne paddock there, where the silt has, or the flow has been a lot faster, there has not been as much deposition. But as we've come through and the fences have slowed the flow of the water, we've had more deposition coming down and deeper and varying levels. Thank you, Annette. Right, so on the right there is a photo of some of the sediments that we've got from the Mock Valley. And as Sue was alluding to before regarding the anaerobic conditions, basically it comes down to, are we seeing it, smell it, or can we smell it? Because if we're getting a capping off over the top, as Sue said, there's no oxygen underneath and the roots won't be able to breathe. They still need oxygen down there. What was really pleasing with our flood deposition here is, along with the plastic bottle in there, there's also a lot of earthworm castings, which means the worms have actually come up from the soil below and are working their way through. So in this situation, we're not going to have that anaerobic sediment layer forming. Thank you, Annette. So this is just a guide. Again, it's a rehash of a lot of information be out there in terms of what the sediment type is. With the texture that we've got, is it a clay loam, silty, or sand? We have not as much clay in a lot of ours, and we've got more silt and sand in a lot of our flood areas. Thank you. So when taking stock on the farm, we're trying to see what that cover is like. And if we go back to the slides that Annette had up earlier with the farm further down the valley, we didn't see as much damage. It's because sediment's been faster, water's been faster and the sediment's covered. And so the area the paddock covered is going to help us decide what we can do. And I apologise. To faster profitable we can get back in at an rate. So not everything's going to be able to be fixed overnight. As Tim said, it's still ongoing for him now. We need to focus on those better areas and within the budget that you've got. Thank you, Annette.
So what we've just done is we've pulled together some different sediments and different soil tests that we have got. And yeah, this is going to be starting to the discussion on what to do next. So here are some soil tests that are sent in. We heard Sue say that it was low organic matter and poor structure and low nitrogen. And all of the soil tests that we have been collected, and all of these are at 15 centimetres, so they're going down quite deep. So, but you can see from this one, we have the coarse sands which drop out first. This one, it's got a reasonable pH, it's not too low. But do see that it's got very low Olsen Ps and, very little organic matter and low levels of other things.
That I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, where the farm map is overlain under the imagery, and there are two paddocks here that we've tested earlier on after the flooding. One is the corner paddock, which is in the top middle, and then as we come down, Goldie, which is in the bottom of the middle. And you can see here that the pH is again quite high. The phosphate levels are very low, as are the potassium, and as such, got no sulfurs there, organic or plant available sulfate sulfur. The magnesium levels are high, but that is a factor of the underlying parent material in the Motueka Valley. We've got a dunite rock that will be eroding through, which is giving our magnesium level. So the P retention, as Sue talked about earlier, is the amount that the soil hold in terms of the phosphate. As Sue said, under 10 is considerably lower, which means, as she said, we don't want to put big amounts on, but it's more going to be a little and often to kind of feed it, because these are new soils. We don't have the structure, we don't have the nutrient cycling or the organic matter or microbes in there doing their thing at the moment. Thank you.
So just note that that's a 10 to 30 centimetre silt across the paddock, and this is what it looks like. So with our people here, what would people be doing with this? Given that soil test, it's sand, 10 to 30 centimetres, what would you be doing with that?
What was the underlying soil like? Was it good fertility, good production?
It was the Olsen P was about 4 times higher than what it is currently. We still had low potassium levels. The picture on the right is actually part of the area, and there's a lot of earthworm castings coming up through there. But again, the variation and ruffles of the silt and the sand through this paddock was quite marked.
How sandy is that?
Again, it varies across the paddock, just based on the amount of flow that we've had. Our silt levels in the flood that we had here were nowhere near the levels that you had across the region wide.
So would that like dry bog attractor sandy or dry bogger roller sort of thing?
It'd definitely dry bog a roller.
Yeah, most of the paddocks have dried out reasonably quickly because they are sand and it's really free draining underneath. And the water didn't lie for very long, usually, between 1 and 3 days, because it is so free draining along the river.
How big an area is it of the sand? Well, I'll tell you what's sitting in my head. If the area wasn't that big, I'd try to get rid of the sand. But it's bloody expensive.
Yeah, so that is into the corner paddock. It was just a smaller 3-hectare paddock there, and the sand would probably have made up about a hectare there. But again, as you say, as Lachie alluded to as well, the benefit of having that building up there now means that there will be a lesser chance of a flood event from a minor flood, as that paddock will be actually higher. So that's one. Sorry, Helly.
That's what we did. We got rid of the sand. We had a dozer and we pushed the sand back to the river edge, it kind of into the paper road, but you still left with a good 10 centimeters of sand in places because they can't, you can get rid of some of it, but you can't get rid of all of it. So we went from about half a meter down to 10 centimeters.
I suppose the only reason I was responding like that is I know with either sweet corn or maize grain or squash, where we've got some paddocks with some sand seams through it, the yield is just unbelievably poor in those sand areas. So I'm always a fan of trying to get rid of it if you can. But we've got a paddock, we couldn't get rid of it, it was too deep. And it's sandy. So we're just going to suck it up and just go, oh, well, that's a bit of bad luck that it's shitty in that bit of the paddock.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that we will be able to look at you doing is feeding out a lot on those areas to try and rebuild some organic matter as quickly as we can.
Good idea.
One of the things I'd do, Simon, is that you actually don't consider that block on its own. Consider it as the whole farm. I mean, look at the whole farm and see what your strengths and limitations and what you've got over the rest of the farm. If you're short of free draining soils or stuff that's becomes, you need the valuable free draining soils in the wintertime for heavy cattle, I'd be keeping it. I'd be looking at what your resources are over the rest of the farm and deciding how does that fit into my system, and if it does, if it becomes a valuable asset, I'd be looking after it.
Well, the benefit of this is that there is irrigation in that area there, so soil moisture through the summer won't be an issue, and having that, as you say, a freer draining soil is definitely going to be a bonus. Somewhere in the presentation, there is actually a paddock scorecard. So actually saying just that is looking at the farm as a whole and ranking your paddocks and scoring your paddocks to see where you should be focusing on first. And, as Hallie alluded to, where she's got a lower level of silt deposition, we can potentially oversow with our legumes into there without having to do much, and they will keep going. Where you've got other areas where it's going to be more than a year or so to try and get something back in, is go through a break crop first. Time of the year would mean that we can't actually look at annuals at the moment, but going into the autumn we can. But again, if we don't do anything at the moment, what will germinate will be a plethora of weed seeds that have come down with the sediment.
It's not a negative. It gives you a chance to control them.
Absolutely. Yep.
Is there any option when it is free draining like this in the sand for putting in lucerne? You talked about deep rooted crops.
Yeah.
Would that be an option? Because it's a legume and it's got a deep root?
You know, you're only talking 15 to 20, 30 centimeters, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yep.
So maybe you got to decide, well, you know, what's the maximum depth I can go to with a giant ripper or whatever, or plough, and differentiate the two out.
Well, and again, as you've said, Lachie, and Tim's also said that after this event, the existing fence lines don't necessarily need to be put back to where they were. It's actually working with what you've got.
The problem is if you end up with more than one land management unit in the paddock, you can only manage it to the lowest common denominator.
Yes.
So, you know, it's a key to understanding those land resources to drive it forward, really.
And this here is from lower down in the valley. And this is 3 separate paddocks, but basically adjacent to each other, and just showing the variability of the silt deposition or the sediment that was in the paddocks and the fertility variation across it. But overall, what we talked about before, high pH, low Olsen P or phosphate, which is our main driver of production, a little bit more variation in terms of the potassium, low sulfurs, and low soil phosphate retentions and cation exchange capacities, which is the soil's ability to hold on to our nutrients. So we can build organic matter up to help hold those nutrients and moisture. Thank you, Annette.
So these are some of the ones that we haven't had the soil tests back, and there is a lot of this type in the catchment. Only 2 to 3 centimeters of silt, with occasional deeper bits when the low-lying areas, the grass is still alive, it's growing through. When do you decide to direct drill? When do you decide to leave it?
So there is a really good flow chart that, and I believe it was one that came out after the Manawatu floods. It's on the Motueka Catchment Collective. I know you've had a bit to do with that one, Annette, and that helps to give some guidance on the way to approach it. And if you use that in conjunction with looking at what you've got on your farm, you can make that decision, because every farm, every situation is going to be different based on what you can afford to do and what your goals are, and whether you want to bring that land back into productivity or whether you're going to look at retiring some of the areas. As Tim talked about, the fencing that was damaged, if it happens quite regularly, then potentially you might look at some of that on some of the areas around your watercourses.
Sorry, did you refer to a document? You broke up at the start of your sentence. Is there
Yeah, I'll be sending that document out to
Okay.
everybody who's registered. That was one of the 2 documents I was going to send out. But take this one on the left here. Yeah, it's relatively open. It's got 2 or 3 centimeters of silt in it. Tim, what would you be doing with that paddock?
I'd round up it off, and because you're going to end up with a hell of a weed challenge in there probably if it was me. What I've found, I've tried to save paddocks like that before, and they've kind of come away, but the clover never really did. The ryegrass did, and then they're a bit kind of sick. It would depend, as Simon said, depending on where you're at with your kind of all your other paddocks and what's going on and the time of year and all that sort of thing. But ideally for me, I'd be round upping that. I wouldn't worry about cultivating it. I'd just be going straight in and direct drilling it.
With what?
It would depend the time of year. If you're heading into, for us, if I'm heading into the spring, I'll be putting some type of brassica crop in there. Depends if you've got irrigation. There's a whole lot of variables on what I'd put in there. If I had irrigation and everything was perfect, I may put it back into permanent grass, depends what else is going on the farm. But 2 to 3 centimetres of silt for me is not a big deal.
It's going to mix
just,
in, Tim?
Yeah, it's just,
Yeah, earthworms is going to do that.
yeah, I wouldn't be, it's not a big deal at all, 2 to 3
Yeah.
centimetres. The biggest deal will be the weeds that come away in that, and your paddock might be a little bit bumpy.
So if you see this one on the bottom right, that paddock was quite bumpy. The grass was long before it was flooded, and the farmers come along and grazed it, and it sort of leveled it all out with cattle. So he was quite impressed with the job that the cattle had done on that. Is there any, for these sorts of, would you ever oversow as you were grazing sort of legumes, or not at all? You'd all just always direct drill?
Look, now this is just me personally. When you're oversowing with clovers, you can go to a whole lot of trouble and expense and end up with a fairly average job. If you're going to go to that extent and you've got the equipment, direct drilling's pretty quick, and you're going to get a much better strike rate. You're going to get a higher yielding, and you're going to have a new grass. That's my personal view.
These slides just show the classic that we were talking about. This one here, the variability just associated with the hydrology of the water flow going over it. This settled out, this was sand. Going through these farms, we have seen quite a lot of wet baleage and hay and things around, and there's baleage all the way down the river. They're going to have to find something to do with. That's a potential way of building up organic matter on some of the soils. And here's just another shot showing that in the sandy stuff there is worms coming all the way through. We didn't see, we dug quite a few holes as we were taking the test. We didn't see any anaerobic situations at all. But that doesn't mean that there's not one. It's obviously a key thing to look at. There we go, Simon. There's your final slide. And I'm sorry for scrambling your talk. I did try and structure it so we had that chunk.
It's lovely.
No, that's all good. So basically, again, this is nothing new. It's what everybody has been talking about tonight. It's knowledge is power. Your approach, it's going to be specific to your own property, to what you're wanting to achieve. And that's where, as Lachie said, it's not looking at a paddock and its individuality. It's looking about how it factors into the whole of your operation. Thank you.
And this is, because we're small farms and we're not going to have the fancy kit that Tim showed us towing around the paddocks. This is just a score sheet for actually doing some visual assessments, digging a few holes and just working out what the silt is going across your paddock and assessing it. And that will give you an opportunity to rank that. But also do be aware that, look at how much of your property's been affected. Generally speaking, what I've seen, and I haven't been up in some of the worst areas, to be fair, the Motopico, there's just some paddocks alongside the river that have been affected. And in some cases, for smaller farms, that's a lot of the property, but on the bigger farms, it's just a smaller amount. Are there any questions now?
Is there any particular, I'm assuming the crop 20 is a type of fertilizer, right, Tim? Is there any particular fertilizer that works better post floods than others, or do you really have to look at the soil test and work from there?
So without having a soil test, the likes of a Crop Master 20 or a Crop Master 15, they are generally a good shotgun approach. It provides nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, and sulfur, all of the things that we are low in there. Sue said earlier on that the legumes are our friends, and that's what we need to drive the system. But legumes are good for our system because they fix their own nitrogen. but they need the other fertility, they need the other nutrients such as the phosphate, potassium and sulfur, and a good aerobic soil to be able to do that. And until we can actually get that nitrogen fixation happening, then we kind of need to just give the system a little bit of a help along, as it were.
Even if you're planting legumes, you'd still want a bit of nitrogen in this situation, because the reason most people don't plant nitrogen when you don't use nitrogen when you're planting legumes is that it encourages whatever else you're planting with it, like the grasses, and they tend to swamp out the clover. But in this situation, the grasses are really going to struggle because they've got no other source of nitrogen, and the legumes are going to actually benefit from the nitrogen you put in when you do it at planting. Later on, some nitrogen applied will actually make the clovers lazy. They'll reduce their nitrogen production. But when you're getting them established, it's quite a good idea in this situation, especially if you're doing legume only. There's nothing else to compete with it. It's a really good opportunity to help those legumes get established quickly.
And would you, like Tim, you said 250 kilos per hectare? Is that how much you would put on initially?
So basically, we knew roughly what our soil tests were likely to be because we've had a few of these floods. So, and it was just annual grass, and this is kind of just, and I just said to Sue, what are we going to do? Sue said, right, smack that on and let's get the system going. And I was all over that because I knew I needed to get my P levels up, and I knew I needed to get some nitrogen in there. Some sulfur was going to help because that'd be terrible. So I was just going, tell me what to put on and I'll put it on. So yeah, it's about as good about so it ends for the experts in that. Yeah.
The good thing about crop 20 is it's got a high ratio of nitrogen, and that's the nitrogen is the thing that grass needs the most of. The phosphate it needs some of, and so to get that annual up and going, the crop 20, the high ratio of nitrogen to phosphate was good. And we didn't need the sulfur, but you guys do by the sound of it.
We do.
And
some potassium.
One focus I did have though was I knew I needed to get those P levels up a long way. It might have been that I knew the tests were coming. It might have been 3, it might have been 5, it might have been 8 Olsen P. Wouldn't have been any higher than 8. I'd bet the house on that. So I was pretty keen to just start throwing P in from day one to get that up as fast as I could.
Right, are there any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question. Going back to Simon's picture of our corner paddock, would you say long term it would be cheaper to push off the sandy silt, or with all the costs of fertilizer and whatever else and lower production over time, would it be cheaper just to push it off and start back where you were rather than trying to do years and years of working through the silt?
Unfortunately, I'll give you what I don't know your system, and it's hard for me to. My view would be I'm picking up on Lachie's point though, in terms of if there's a potential use for it, maybe. But my experience with sand is if I can get rid of it, I will, because I know the difference in yield I can get if I don't have the sand. I know I'm not answering your question very well, but it's just probably I haven't got a good enough feel for what it looks like.
I would say that there is scope for scraping some of that off in the bottom of the corner, but there is over parts of the paddock where it's not that deep, and if we just incorporate that, we won't be compromising as much, and it will be a cheaper option, and I don't think it will be that much longer to get that area back into production.
I think it's a very good idea to, when you're doing your paddock, just do a few calculations of, okay, so this is 30 centimeters deep and it's about this X meters squared or a hectare of it and how many meter cubes of sand that is, and then where are you going to put it, and then what are you going to do with it. So often it doesn't look much, but once you start mounding it up, it can be, you know, quite a large amount. And then what are you going to do with it? Or are you just going to leave it in the mound of the back paddock, and then the next flood that comes along spreads it back over? You know, it's what are you going to do with it is the thing. And if you have to truck it off, or you don't have a use for it, then you have to factor all those costs into it as well.
I guess I'd be slightly more comfortable that you've got irrigation, so that'll help you drive some production when it gets a bit dry. Feeding out on it's probably a good idea too.
Yeah, we did have irrigation. Most of that went down the river, but that's all right.
Bugger.
Also, with the other paddocks that have got a lot of gravel as well, my thinking was pushing the gravel into the hollower or the lower areas, and then covering with the silt. Would that be beneficial?
Lachie, you'd be better to answer that than me.
Oh, look, if you're going to do that, I'd strip the topsoil off it before you did it. You know, if you've got topsoil there, and I'd be spreading it through, but remembering that you want to get it's a paddock. Well, you don't have irrigation anymore, I suppose, but I guess you got to think about it. You know, look, if the soil moisture holding capability is, you've only got 10 centimeters of soil that you put on top, you know, you've only got 2 days before it shuts up shop for you in the middle of the summer. You know, so you actually have to put quite a bit of topsoil on it to actually make it work. You want more than 10 centimeters, or you know, you want 20, 30 centimeters stuff on top of it. And you got to try and grow that topsoil, you know, on that side of it too. So yeah.
The other thing to be aware of, we saw right at so all the silt that's dumped on the side of the road, the council needs to find is going to truck it away, but some of it is reasonable quality and some of it has some organic matter in it. So I mean, I don't know up your way, but there's certainly some really good quality silt sitting at Ngāti Moti that yeah, you could get a test of. And one of those tests I showed you was the bulk test of the silt sitting at the Rewalker. And one of the local farmers there is taking that and putting it on his paddock. And once again, I guess building it up doesn't cost him anything. It's being spread across the property. I mean, that's a long shot, won't work for many people, because I will say that most of our silt is very sandy and horrible that's stacked up. It's just something.
If you go import silt, I mean, there's silt and there's silt. You know, the simple test is to grab a handful of stuff, or not, you know, a small handful of stuff, throw a bit of water in it, and look, if you can push a worm through your fingers, push it up through your fingers, and it goes longer than, say, you know, 2 inches, you know, it's got a truckload of clay in it. You know, I wouldn't be marching clay onto my place. I'd be wanting to make sure it's in that range between an inch and a couple of inches, but I'd be doing that test. Simple test that you can do yourself on the mound and know that actually I'm going to get some reasonable textures into your soil. You know, you don't want to put stuff that's got too much sand. If you've got too much sand, you know, it'll be less than less than an inch that stuff will break off on. So, you know, it's just a matter of just trying to be smart about what you're trying to achieve and not trying to stuff up the hydrology of the soil going forward. Because the last thing you want to do is have a part of your paddock that's got a different hydrology than the rest of the paddock. You know, it's because you can't manage it the same way.
And would you be looking at the colour of the silt as also an assessing? Because we've got some silt that's
I
really black.
I think it's too early to see on the colours in the sense that if you're trying to look for mottles, you know, mottles take about 3 or 4 months of being anaerobic to start to develop. And so the anaerobic stuff is just iron and manganese coming out of solution and precipitating out. It's the old fifth form chemistry stuff coming back to
Yeah.
haunt you.
No, I was actually talking about using how black it is. So some of the salt
Look,
is
if it's
really
black,
black.
it's going to have probably more organic matter in it generally.
Yeah.
Yeah, compared to the brown stuff that you're probably going to get with some of those, you know, so those sands that are out your way.
Yeah,
Mm.
or bright yellow.
Yeah, bright
Yes,
yellow.
with the
Yeah.
granite.
Yeah.
sand.
Look, you know, look, it's great to import organic matter, but you know, you run the risk of weeds too, but you can control those chemically, I guess, you know.
So we've got about a hectare right on the river boundary. And like I said, we had quite a bit of sand come on,
Yeah.
0.5 meter in some places, varying. So we had that pushed off with the dozer. So now we're left with 3-4 centimeters to maybe 10-15 centimeters of sand, but it's a mixture of sand and silt, but it's predominantly river sand. So now we're thinking, what do we do now? Do we put a chain harrow over it, flatten it out as much as we can? Do we drill seed into it? Do we just oversow? Do we just leave it for, because we can just shut that area up. We don't have to graze it. What do we do?
I'd be trying to get some, and I know Tim would be the same. You'd be trying to get some level of productivity out of it. You know, you know, you need to have Simon out there to give you a conversation on the ferts to go into it. But you know, typically you've got to try one way or another. You've got to get some vegetation growing on it, and preferably not weed species. If you leave it for weed species, you know the quality of what you can do with that's very limited. You know, I'd be trying to get something decent into it.
One idea I'll be doing on some of that, or one option on that stuff that does work quite well, is you can punch in an oak crop. It'll need a fair bit of end, but punch in an oak crop, and then you can strip graze that off with cattle. And cattle do a pretty good job of smoothing, as you saw in that last photo, actually, smoothing off a paddock as well, and actually spreading around. Obviously, they're putting the organic matter from the oats back in as well through the feces. So that's one not bad option that's worked for us in the past.
So do you direct drill the oats into?
Yep. And the beauty about oats is such a big seed. You can go tearing through if it's not quite even and it goes in a bit deep. It doesn't matter. It'll still come up. And then when you strip it off for the cattle do a pretty good job of actually moving some of that sand and stuff around as well, and it's kind of spreading it all around. That it's worked for us quite well in the past.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, and it becomes the real strength of that boom against the river is that, I mean, obviously it's going to have some reasonable drainage, and typically right close to the source of the river, you're going to have it's going to be higher up. It's going to have coarser materials like your sands and probably got the gravels underneath it somewhere. But the strengths are that in the wintertime, you know, when the rest of the farm's pugging like buggery, that area is not. You know, it's there lies your opportunity.
Okay. We've gone over our time. So just want to thank everybody very much for coming along and sharing their ideas. I think what we've demonstrated is that every flood is different, but the principles probably still hold across lots of different situations. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to the speakers, much appreciated. And yes, let's hope that we don't have a particularly dry summer, though who knows, we've had a lot of rain. Any final words from anyone?
Thank you very much.
Best of luck, things will get better.
Excellent.
All the best to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all.